You are listening to Blue Please here on CynicalBrit.com with myself, Total Biscuit. Yes, you are. That is just the way of it. There is no choice in the matter. You cannot escape. You cannot get away. Deal with it. Right, I want to talk about ICC, because the guild had a few issues, that being Dark with the Skies, our 10-man raiding guild on Mazrigo Horde-side EU. We lost not one, but two paladins! Yeah, it's terrifying. We actually managed to lose a bunch of paladins. I don't know how that happened, honestly. It's like, weirdly, just like, hey, paladins have disappeared. That's really awkward, isn't it? But yeah, we lost a bunch of paladins, and that wasn't too great. But we managed to get a new healer and get everything sorted out, and as well as getting another paladin for bench work, and we got going again. Now, we'd been trapped on Rotface for the simple reason that we hadn't had a proper raid together. We didn't have a main healer, so we couldn't keep the tank alive. Obviously, everything went to hell. So we got a new healer, and we killed Rotface, and then we killed Festagut, and then we killed Putricide, and then we killed the Blood Princes, and then for the last 10 minutes of the raid, we bashed our head against Blood Queen. Not bad for a night's progress, quite frankly. That was pretty good. I want to talk a little bit about the Plague Wing of ICC, and I want to analyse it and just, is it up to anything? Because I gave you the impressions the first week of ICC when I cleared 4 bosses. I talked a lot about the things that were there, and I think the assessment that I came to was, it was pretty good. There's a lot of nice, kind of nostalgia, really, to be honest, coming from the fact that the raids themselves were basic. Yeah, and they used the same kind of mechanics that we've seen for ages, and a lot of them did remind me of other raids that I had done in the past. You know, things like Lord Marigar just felt like a really classic fight, something that was way, way behind the times. You know, it was old, it used old-style mechanics. I mean, it's Leothorus crossed with a bit of Archimond in there, let's be honest, as well as High Overlord Nagentus. Yeah, that was the cross. That was the little hybrid. It's like, we have taken 3 fights from the previous expansion, mashed them all together, and there you go. A lot of it felt like that, until, of course, you got to the airship battle, which is nothing like that. And then you go back to Sourfang, which has an interesting new mechanic in it. And then you go on from there. So, Sourfang was the first real test for the guild. It didn't take all that long. It took us maybe a night of wipes to get that sorted out. But, yeah, we killed him. And then we moved on, and, of course, we didn't really have a lot of an opportunity to kill Rotface, and we finally managed to do it. So I want to talk about the Plague Wing. So let's have a look at Rotface. So Rotface was the first one that we did, which arguably was a mistake, because that's not the easy order. Yeah? The easy order is left, right, middle. Yeah? You can't get in the middle until you kill left and right. Left is Festagut, right is Rotface, and there's 2 annoying dog mini-bosses in between them. Hell, even the dog mini-boss on the left is easier than the dog mini-boss on the right. Maybe they just wanted people to do it in that order, but of course, when you give people a choice, they're evidently going to run straight into the hard guys and wipe, and that's okay. So, let me talk about Rotface. Rotface is a really, really solid encounter, as in terms of the challenge that it presents to a relatively average raid, as well as the mechanics involved. Yeah. So what have you got on Rotface? You've got kiting, you've got a lot of movement. Yeah. Dodging a conal-based attack requires a lot of situational awareness, and you'll be surprised, actually, how many people fail at this. And indeed, our guild failed way too many times at moving out of the way of the spray, because it wasn't obvious where, at least on the ground or anything, where it was actually going to go. You know, when you read the description, that it's like a 30-degree cone or whatever in front of it. But it's about observing which way he's facing. And you know what? I don't think a lot of raiders actually have that kind of observational skill these days. I think that's just something that Wrath of the Lich King has done. It's like, you've got to look at where he goes. I remember how many freaking raiders failed on the gauntlet in Thorim. Remember how many? I can bet that someone in your guild got hit repeatedly by those fire things. You want to know why? Because you had to actually observe the enemy and see which direction he was going to shoot in. And funnily enough, that's something that is a little bit different from just relying on deadly boss mods all the time. Having to actually look and be situationally aware instead of staring at bars and grid. is a skill I think that is lost now on a lot of people. So, yeah, that screwed us over a couple of times until I slapped my raiders around and said, what the hell are you doing? Pay attention. Just run 5 feet that way. It's really not that hard. Kiting, yeah, kiting was pretty interesting. And the mechanic the main mechanic of this fight involves the spawning of a ooze. And this ooze, the first ooze has to be kited around, and then the second ooze has to be kited to the first ooze, and they will merge together to form a big ooze, which then has to be kited by somebody, and the off-tank, that's their dedicated job. So we had a Death Knight doing it, which is generally a pretty good choice. And you kite the big ooze around, and every time someone gets the infection debuff, they have to run to the big ooze, but not too close, because if it runs too close, you die from AoE damage, and that would suck. Run in there, get dispelled, which will spawn an ooze, and then make them merge together. And when the oozes reach a critical mass, they will explode and fire ooze all over the room. And if you stand in it, you generally die horribly. Now, to make this more interesting, the Professor Putricide floods quadrants of the room with poison gas, which will basically kill you horribly if you call it the slime pipe as it happens. Good news, everyone! The slime is flowing again! That's the effete British version, incidentally. You can see Putricide sitting in his armchair, rocking backwards and forwards, supping some Earl Grey on a fine summer's afternoon. Yes. Terrifying, isn't it? It's the Murloc. Yeah, it really is the Murloc, isn't it, when you come to think of it? Good news, everyone! The slime is flowing again! Ha ha! Terrifying. That would be the best raid boss. I would pay big money, Blizzard. Do it. Make the Murloc raid boss. You know you want to. Right. So, the quadrants get flooded with this crap, and if your off-tank is running through it too much, chances are he's going to end up dying, and if anyone accidentally stands in it, that's a lot of damage being dealt. So you've got that, you've got the explosion, and you've got a 30 or so % enrage to cap that all off. It's a fight based around movement, and I tend to find, in my experience, that fights overly based around movement really screw people over, because people get tunnel vision, and they just like, oh, I must do optimum damage, You want to know how much of a battle it was to get some of my members to switch out their Ice Walker or their attack power boot enchants for Tuskar's Vitality? It's like, I'd show them the math and say, look, seriously, the 8% extra movement increase actually increases your DPS in the long run on most encounters. For God's sake, switch out to Tuskar's Vitality. It'll let you outrun the oozers. It will make sure you are moving less. It makes perfect sense, but yeah, you get a lot of resistance to that. I think, again, people get a bunch of crazy tunnel vision, and they must do optimum DPS. They must do optimum healing, and they can't do that if they move, so they're just going to eat the damage, eat the oozers, run in the wrong place. It's crazy. But it's good, honestly. And I think a lot of subpar guilds are really going to run into a brick wall with that fight. The involvement of each individual raid member, particularly in 10-man mode, in this particular encounter, is actually quite high. You've got to move, and that's something a lot of people just aren't used to. You've effectively got to kite, which is, again, something that people aren't really used to. It's good. I like that encounter. It's a lot of fun. Probably one of my favourite encounters so far, to be quite honest. Now, Festiga, unfortunately, doesn't really... It's okay, but it doesn't really reach that level of achievement that Rot faces. It's not as hard, for one thing, and it's based more on statistics than actually moving around an awful lot. There is a movement element to it. So here's what happens with Festiga. Festiga will occasionally spawn 2 spores. This is in 10-man mode. And these spores provide an explosive inoculation against a poison gas cloud that he belches out at some point. So you're constantly taking raid damage from this stuff, and he's also firing out something which requires you to be spaced out. This is his, quote, clever mechanic. His clever mechanic is, well, in order to be properly inoculated against my big kill-everything attack, you have to stand close to someone who has a spore on them. However, if you do that the entire fight, you end up getting an kind of explosive vomiting debuff, which causes massive area of effect damage. So you've got to be spaced out, and then you've got to move in for this. Now, the only real difficulty of this fight, except for the challenge on the healers, who have to frequently switch in certain phases of the fight between damage to the raid and damage to the tank is the fact that these spores can end up spawning on random members. So you could end up getting 2 in the melee group. Now, they only cover about 5 people each with the inoculation buff. So if the guy in the melee group gets it and another guy in the melee group gets it, one has got to run outside to an area where the ranged DPS and sometimes the healers can get into range and get that inoculation. Because if you don't get it, you're pretty much dead. That's all that fight really is. It's also got a pretty hard enrage on it as well, so there is a DPS check on it, but we didn't fail that DPS check at all. And we screwed up the... I suppose you would call it the execution in terms of the spores a couple of times, and that really causes a few problems. People didn't really realise what the spores were all about, and that you couldn't just stand in the big group and get the spore inoculation debuff. It didn't work that way. But, yeah, eventually we killed it. It's not as impressive as Rotface, honestly. I think Rotface is a very nicely balanced and challenging encounter, and I've heard it's pretty good in hard mode as well. Festigot, on the other hand, it's a check encounter. It's a DPS check, it's a healing check, and, of course, it's a stupidity check. So, Putricide. I think, to be honest, I heard too much about Putricide, and as a result, I was actually disappointed in what Putricide had to offer. No, really, I'm not kidding. So, Putricide offered this amazing encounter, so people said. It had amazing, funny voice acting, and it was really hard and challenging, and blah, blah, blah. And I suppose maybe it is quite hard in 25-man, but we only tried it like 3 times before killing him, honestly. I didn't really see what was so difficult about that fight. You had a little bit of vehicle in there, as in your off-tank controls and Abomination that eats slime pools on the ground. So think a little bit of Lord Malchezaar. Indeed, you do not face Putricide alone, but the slime that I command. Something along those lines. He spawns a bunch of slime all over the room. The slime pools get progressively bigger. You've got to control the Abomination to eat the slime. By eating a certain amount of slime, you can do a slowing debuff on the adds that he spawns. These adds can be really nasty. They generally move towards a target and do horrendous damage if they reach him. One of them explodes and does AoE damage based on how many people are around the person in question. So if there's no one there, they're basically dead. It's a one-shot kill. But you can reduce the damage quite considerably by moving in. So there's no other way to slow these things down. You've got to debuff them, and they will freeze the target so that you can't really get away so easily. Unless you have certain ways of doing so, like Blink gets out of it, Ice Block, things like that. Whereas the other adds, they're called Gas Clouds, and they do damage and things like that. So I think actually what was most intriguing about the fight, other than the rather amusing voice acting, was once he got into Phase 2, he started throwing what was called malleable goo. Now this stuff arcs through the air, and raid warnings don't say malleable goo on you. They generally say malleable goo near you. And again, it's another visual thing. You see this potion spiraling through the air with goo flying all over the place, and you've got to get the hell out of the way, because if you get hit by this, you're boned. It's like a 300... Obviously, it can't be a 300% decrease in casting speed. That would be absurd, but it's a massive decrease in casting speed. 300% longer duration in casting speed. I knew I'd seen that number somewhere. And that will screw you over really well. If a healer gets that, you're basically dead. A lot of damage involved in that fight, a lot of movement as well. And in Phase 3, it's a massive DPS race, because the Abomination, you can't be used anymore to eat slime, and a lot more gets spawned. So, Malchezaar style, the entire room gets completely covered. It's a pretty decent fight. It's not what I would call groundbreaking in any way. It's solid. Yeah, it's a good encounter. It's not below average. It's not really above average. It's just kind of cool. And yeah, it's got some funny voice acting, and there are encounters that benefit an awful lot from that. XT002 is still, to me, absolutely hilarious. Mimiron, to some degree, is absolutely hilarious. I don't really know about Putricide. I think because I'd heard so much about it, the jokes were not effective. And honestly, the voice acting wasn't that great anyway. You know, really. I heard things like that, and at the start of Phase 2, he says, like, some tentacles come out of his shoulders. He's like, huh? Where'd these come from? Like, right, well, there's no enthusiasm behind that, and I don't suppose it was all that great, but the fight itself is good, and I've heard that the hard mode is an absolute nightmare to deal with, so I'm definitely looking forward to cracking my head up against that one. As of now, I believe only 6 or so guilds have actually killed it in hard mode. That's on 25-man, so that's extremely interesting. Those look to be the 2 big hurdle encounters in the hard mode, the Putricide encounter and the Lich King. We'll see how that one goes. I'm looking forward to giving it a crack. Now that we've beaten Putricide, I think we'll be fine up until Syndragoza. We might wipe on Syndragoza a little bit, and then we'll be talking about the Lich King, and then getting into some hard modes. Oh yes, there's some good stuff. Thus far, though, ICC is pretty solid. I must say, I haven't seen any of those dailies yet, those random dailies that appear. Actually, weeklies, what am I talking about? These weekly repeatable quests that apparently can give you some bonus frost badges. They can spawn in various areas of the dungeon. Haven't seen one yet. Just bad luck more so than anything else. But hey, otherwise, it's pretty good. The loot's good. The bosses are... They vary from boss to boss, really. Some of it's really good. I think Festigut was probably the weakest of the three. Rotface is still my favourite encounter in there, and Putricide is good for novelty, but I think it's going to get very stale very fast, whereas you've always really got to be awake on Rotface, and maybe not quite as much on Putricide, at least in 10-man mode. My name is Total Biscuit, you are listening to Blue Please here on CynicalBrit.com. The illusion of choice, ladies and gentlemen, is coming up after this. Yes, indeed. Email your questions for the illusion of choice, themurloc@gmail.com. Pick the last topic of the show, and then after a brief break, we'll do some Zerg Please. I have to download the patch, and then we can do some Zerg Please commentary. Yes, live audio commentary here on CynicalBrit.com, and I'll be providing the replay file. Yes, the replay file at the end of the show, and when the podcast comes out so that you can watch along. I'll be right back after this, folks. Enjoy.